Around 4 miles down the road from the famous Grossinger's Resort sat, at one point, another iconic property. It operated for decades not as an amenities-rich hotel, but a star-studded one, known as the place Jerry Lewis chose to spend his downtime. But as this once iconic hotel declined, along with most of the Catskills, it eventually turned into a condo complex, and would later meet a violent end and be left completely abandoned. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 90-second episode of Abandoned, let's find out how this hotel rose to fame, declined over decades, and was left completely abandoned in a state of isolation. We'll also hear from those who actually lived there, and ultimately had to abandon their own belongings. This is the Browns Resort, later known as Grandview Palace. It started in the Catskill Mountains, specifically in the hamlet of Loch Sheldrake. It was the 1920s when two brothers of the Apel family constructed a charming hotel on the top of a small hill called the Black Apel Inn. 2 decades later though, a businessman who was in the hospitality industry named Charles Brown would ultimately purchase the Black Apel for $70,000, or around $1.2 million today. The original inn featured lots of land, great views of the adjacent lake, and a few activities like tennis courts. The Browns saw its potential, and upon their purchase in 1944, they would invest even more money to turn the property into a 473-room luxury resort called the Charles and Lillian Brown's Hotel and Country Club. Over the next couple of decades, it would become known simply as just the Browns. But that didn't mean it lost any of its panache. In fact, the resort would expand over those decades and become a very notable resort. This was a time when the Catskills was a popular tourist destination. Nicknamed the Borscht Belt, it was an area that catered to Jewish Americans, primarily those who lived in New York City. Upstate New York and the rolling green mountains within the Catskills provided a serene and inviting escape from the hot summers in the city. I've talked about and actually been inside a few of these resorts which had sprung up during this time, notably Grossinger's, which was literally just down the street from the Browns. Regardless of all this competition though, the Browns continued to grow as a popular and friendly hotel with a certain level of prestige. Between balancing its down-to-earth friendly atmosphere with Charles and Lillian Brown prominently featured on marketing, to a resort that also catered to the wealthy and famous. Notable actors, musicians, and comedians from the city would often try out their new material in the nightclubs of these upstate resorts. The Browns was no exception, and over the years hosted notable people like Sammy Davis Jr., Tony Bennett, Woody Allen, Jackie Mason, Bob Hope, and most famously, Jerry Lewis. Jerry was a regular at the property and actually grew up working for the Browns at a different hotel. Jerry's association with the property was never lost, as he would be worked into a mural while his caricature and name would be used in marketing for the property. All in all, the Browns was one of the most successful resorts of its kind, and it boasted all types of amenities, like a glitzy stage theater named after the marquee celebrity called the Jerry Lewis Theater Club. There was also a lovely indoor and outdoor pool, as well as vast acreage, 260 acres to be exact, all to find relaxation in. The buildings were modern with swanky hotel rooms, many featuring private balconies, while the drive up was lined with perfectly manicured flower beds. New lodging wings would be renovated with styles straight from the West Coast, the resort calling it the Beverly Hills Wing, with quote, Hollywood-style rooms. The Browns was not only considered one of the most luxurious hotels in the Northeast United States, but also one of the most famous. However, the tide was beginning to turn for these famous resorts within the Catskills. By the late 1970s, vacationers were now presented with increasingly more exotic vacation options with the advent of air travel as well as the rise of the cruise industry. Instead of spending your summers a few hours north of Manhattan, you could instead fly to France, or maybe take a cruise to the Caribbean during the winters. As these vacations were on the rise, tourism to the Catskills began to decline. This was especially true as rail lines had begun to scale down their service to the region. But then, the resort suffered an even greater loss. In 1978, Charles Brown had passed away, leaving sole ownership of the resort to his wife and co-owner, Lillian Brown. She continued to operate the resort with year-over-year declines in occupancy. This continued through the early 1980s, where improvements and expansions to the business were being planned. In 1985, the Browns announced the Inner Circle, a group of luxury townhomes made up of around 162 units. The idea was that so many guests had been regulars there that it might make sense to allow them to buy units and live on the property. This was a popular concept at the time, since the hotel portion of the business wasn't seeing the same occupancy, while vacation rentals and timeshares might have been the answer. Investors who bought Grossingers down the street thought so, and Lillian Brown was just following suit. But changes were still in store for the complex. Lillian, who was 82 by this point, was persuaded to step down as president and give power over to her grandson. The change offered a public sense of a new direction for the resort, and perhaps would reassure banks and investors that the hotel was still in competent hands. With the Browns Hotel, and really all of the Catskills resorts, failing to attract younger visitors to the area, business was overall poor. As a result, the hotel started to fall into disrepair. The now 100-acre property was a lot to take care of, and without sufficient money coming through the door to pay to keep it going, the Browns began to lose control. After a failed acquisition of the property, the Browns filed for bankruptcy in July of 1988, owing more than $11 million to over 200 creditors. Despite the dire financial position, the resort's operators claimed that occupancy for the summer was good, nearly filling all 570 hotel rooms. However, since the property was operating on a seasonal basis, the hotel closed in the fall of that year. The property soon went into foreclosure and was sold at auction for $5.3 million. Lillian Brown and their entire family no longer had control of the property, and Lillian herself would pass away in 1997. The new owners, a development company based out of New York, had wanted to continue operating the complex as a hotel. By 1990, and after $2 million were spent on renovations, the Browns reopened under new management as well as a new logo. However, the rebirth of the hotel was short-lived. After burning through millions of investment dollars, the property once again filed for bankruptcy and was put up for sale. Ultimately, it would be purchased by a Miami developer in 1995, one who had big plans for the property. His concept was to convert the resort into nearly 400 condos, all going on the market in 1996. He called it Grandview Palace, and a year later, people started to move into the complex, now converted from hotel rooms to studios and one-bedroom units, all starting from $20,000. Half the units were sold on the first day, and over the years, newspapers would have full-page ads selling this investment opportunity. The actual conversion into condos, though, was pretty interesting, mainly in how it was done. Each hotel room had been converted, largely with people who wanted to use their condo as a vacation home, though some residents did live there full-time. Interestingly though, the rest of the resort was largely untouched. The Browns, as it was, pretty much just continued on, with the majority of its amenities still in place. This included all the buildings, the tennis courts, swimming pools, mini golf, and more. The common areas and fixtures all stayed the same, while the former restaurant and the Jerry Lewis Theater sat untouched. Weirdly, they were rarely used, and as time passed, they sat essentially abandoned in isolation. The property was perhaps a little liminal in a few areas, not exactly highly updated. Vintage furniture populated the lobbies, with many other fixtures looking like they hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But people still really loved spending time here. One family who owned 2 units at Grandview was Henry and Michelle Orginans, who bought their first unit in 2001.
Yeah, well, we liked the environment. The unit was like smaller hotel, like a hotel type unit. You know, we met a lot of friends there, and we had parties and stuff like that. It was just a nice place to be.
While many people loved their resort like a condo community, there was also lingering issues stemming from the building's sheer age. Reported on in the Times Herald Record, in 1999, Grandview Palace received an engineering report that the building had, quote, major structural deficiencies, particularly noting exposed wiring, roof leaks, and violations in the boiler room. The estimated repair bill at the time had come to over $1.3 million. But it does make sense why this report came back the way it did. The core building was built in the 1920s, with structures that bridged off of it built in the decades after. Most of the bones for this building was very old, and we know that the last operators had a hard time keeping up with maintenance. But as years passed, the property continued to face violations and continued neglect. Through 2011, various complaints from residents were issued to the city, prompting several inspections. They found continued violations, most concerning around fire safety. This was around the time when Henry and Michelle's son, Zach Ordonez, filmed the 2012 indie film Palace Living. The majority of the film takes place at Grandview and cinematically captures life there during this time. If you want to watch it yourself, it's available on Vimeo for rent or purchase if you're interested. By January of 2012, the city issued an ultimatum to Grandview, stating that they must correct serious fire safety concerns, or the city might have to condemn the structure as unsafe for human occupancy. Inspectors at the time deemed the situation so serious that they thought the property was in an imminent hazard of fire. The condo board, in charge of running the property, responded with a promise to repair and ensure sprinkler systems and fire alarms would be in working order. Inspectors claimed that they were frustrated with the reaction of the condo and their efforts to fix the violations. Grandview would also now have a security guard on patrol, casing the property for any signs of fire. But residents also came to the defense of the complex, writing letters to the local newspaper that stories regarding the state of the condo was overblown and skewed in a biased negative light. But those safety concerns were about to be proven correct. On April 14, 2012, at around 5:20 p.m., a fire started in the boiler room located in the basement of the main building.
It was a Saturday night, and we were going out to dinner. We had to eat out all our meals. Just as I was approaching, the fire alarm went off. I just assumed it was a false alarm, like other false alarms. But then the elevator stopped working. So I walked down, and just as we left, couple of fire engines started coming. So we went to the restaurant. After eating, it was right down the road, maybe a mile or two down the road. After eating, we went outside to get in the car, and you could see this big flume of smoke coming up.
Smoke was first noticed by a tenant who alerted security guards. By 6:06 p.m., the fire alarm sounded, and despite attempts to extinguish the fire by security, it was already out of control. By the time the local fire department arrived on scene, the situation was not good. The fire, quickly fueled by the wooden structure and endless flammable materials, was an unstoppable force. As it developed through the lobby area, a building which was over 80 years old, the devastation was unbelievable. Flames reached as high as 30 feet in the air, quickly spreading and burning very hot. Over 300 firefighters across 3 counties would ultimately respond to the call, working well into the night to try and control the colossal blaze. By the next morning, the fire was out, but the devastation was incredible. 7 of the 9 main buildings were completely destroyed, leaving behind nothing but a charred outline of what used to be. But despite how violent the fire was, incredibly, no one lost their lives, and just 4 firefighters were treated for mild injuries. That's pretty impressive for what is known as the largest fire to ever ravage the Catskills. While the source of the inferno was identified to originate from the boiler room, the cause was never determined. Various residents who were living there full-time were immediately displaced, and while 2 of the main resident buildings were still standing, one barely touched by the fire, the complex as a whole was ultimately deemed to be uninhabitable and would later be condemned. But that wasn't before residents who were allowed to return to collect their belongings discovered that much of it had already been looted. That was despite 24-hour security. As for other owners, well, to put it gently, it was a massive mess. Essentially, factions began forming within owners, with many banding together to try and vote their existing board of directors out. Claims of understandable incompetency, but even conspiracy theories were being floated around online, with some claiming that the fire was deliberately started by the board of directors, a claim which has basically no evidence. Many owners also wanted to rebuild, hoping that once the insurance money came in, which was around $30 million, they would be able to save what was left and rebuild the remaining units that were lost. This was while other owners, understandably, wanted to get their insurance payout and leave. But as it turns out, that payout wouldn't be so easy. The insurance company was claiming that the building didn't maintain the automatic sprinkler system per their own independent investigation. They found, quote, inoperable fire sprinklers, non-functioning fire alarms, fire and safety code violations, and buildings without 100% sprinkler coverage. They also said that the condo board made false statements on their insurance applications, and therefore their policy would be voided. Grandview, of course, took them to court, with furious owners behind them. To make matters worse, asbestos was found within the buildings, and the smoldering ruins of the facility was leaving the harmful substance exposed to the open air. The condo board was ordered to clean up the mess, which they of course didn't have the funds to do. They would instead institute temporary measures to subdue the exposure by watering the ruins. This meant owners had to pay $90 a month for the ongoing cleanup efforts, which just continued to enrage them. Ultimately, years would pass while this lawsuit worked through the court system. This was while the structure sat practically untouched and abandoned. Owners were not allowed to go back to the property, and despite some security being on site, explorers started to get in. Many hallways and units in the unaffected buildings were relatively clean, while much of the personal belongings of those who lived there remained unclaimed and abandoned. But there was certainly signs of decay, and the overall state of the complex was in rough condition. At this point, it would be a tough argument to make in favor of saving the existing buildings. By late 2017, those owners who understandably had already been through a lot with this whole ordeal got some very, very bad news. The court ultimately sided with the insurance companies, coming to the decision that Grandview failed to maintain functional sprinkler coverage, a requirement that was stated in their insurance agreement. The board would file an appeal for this judgment, but that too failed in June 2018. All owners at Grandview Palace still owned their units on paper, but obviously now had nothing to show for it. With no insurance payout, everyone would effectively lose everything. While there was some talk of suing the original board members, it appears that nothing ever came of it. That makes sense though, as several of those original board members had since passed away.
Well, we paid for the 2 units probably about $100,000.
Yeah.
I think
Maybe
45 and
85.
55. Yeah, everybody lost.
What was left of the former Browns, now Grandview, was left standing with little care going forward. Remarkably though, many sections remained relatively intact. The proper people got inside and explored what was left in 2021. Since the fire nearly a decade prior, many condos were still largely intact. It showed that many residents just never returned to collect their belongings, much of which was ruined anyways. Many units were in a state of isolation, stuck in April of 2012, when residents had to stop what they were doing and leave, many never returning again. With beds still made, pictures on the wall, and food still in the cabinets, it's a pretty remarkable sight of what's still left. Mold has now covered most walls, while paint peels and moss creeps in to still furnished rooms. While many common areas had been completely destroyed, save for a few outdoor activities like the pool, incredibly, the Jerry Lewis Theater survived. It hadn't been used for decades and was decaying while the rest of the structure was occupied. Somehow this opulent space survived the fire. It's now falling apart, with the roof struggling to hold back water. Even to this day, the parts that were unaffected by the fire remain somewhat intact, but year after year, they continue to decay. But of course, the city wants to change that, and in 2020, they proposed seizing the property through eminent domain. After the property failed to find a buyer at a $2 million list price, and with no private developer willing to take on the site, the city would ultimately back down, not wanting to spend taxpayer money to clean it up. Today, the property stands completely abandoned, just down the road from various other abandoned sites. In fact, a few years ago, I made a road trip down to check a few of them out. In doing so, I drove past what was left of the once prestigious hotel, and in person, it is a pretty shocking sight. In the end, the Browns is very emblematic of the rise and fall of the Catskills, and their fleeting golden age. The property was born to fill the need for those looking to get out of the city and enjoy life in the country. The Browns put their own spin on that, bringing in headline-grabbing talent and building a star-studded reputation. But that allure didn't last forever, and the property declined along with the area. The idea to turn these resorts into condos is an interesting one, but it also means there needs to be a developer willing to put in a whole lot of money to ensure the buildings are completely rehabbed to meet modern standards and wouldn't cause issues down the line. Clearly, that's not what happened here. People got swept up in the idea of living at the Browns, owning a part of history and living a resort lifestyle. And I get their anger and frustration, especially after they lost their entire investment and the property itself. Today, it just stands there as a painful reminder of better times in the Catskills. And with no future plans as of right now, it looks like it will continue to be well into the future. This video has been made possible by a service which I've loved for a long time now, HelloFresh. As a very busy and lazy person, I hate having to plan my meals through the weeks and make lengthy trips to the grocery store, all for food which I might have too much of or too little of. It's stressful and sometimes wasteful, which is why I love HelloFresh, as they send me pre-portioned ingredients and easy to understand instructions to craft a delicious meal. Across over 100 constantly changing meal options each week, there's always something to choose from, and from my experience, everything has always been really delicious. This week I tried the Tuscan chicken and chickpea soup, which was fantastic as always. And of course, because I am preparing meals which I would have never cooked otherwise, it's a genuinely fulfilling experience and makes me feel a lot less of an idiot. So you can get up to 20 meals for free and free shipping on your first order at hellofresh.ca with code BRIGHTSUN20. The offer is across 6 boxes for new subscribers only. That's 20 free meals at hellofresh.ca with code BRIGHTSUN20. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.